Have you noticed more oysters at the beach? Harbor WildWatch has. Thanks to our community science beach monitoring program, a novel population of Pacific oysters was detected in the winter of 2015-2016. Because of this observation, we started monitoring oysters to better understand their population dynamics over time and whether recruitment has continued after that initial event. To do this, we take some simple measurements, which is something we're inviting the community to do too. Enjoy this tutorial on how you can get involved with monitoring Pacific oyster populations at a beach of your choice. The procedure is simple. Pick a beach and measure the maximum shell diameter of 100 oysters during a summertime low tide. We currently monitor oysters at 11 sites in the South Sound, but there are more beaches to be observed. The first step for you is to pick a beach you want to monitor. Next, plan a day to go out to the beach during a low tide. Because Pacific oysters are predominantly found above the middle intertidal zone, you won't necessarily need an extreme low tide day in order to conduct this monitoring. A predicted tide below 3 feet should do. In order to plan the date and time for your oyster monitoring adventure, refer to a tide chart near your beach monitoring location and look at your low tide options. If this all sounds overwhelming, we're happy to help you plan your low tide beach day. When you get to the beach, your first mission is to find an area with oysters present. Oysters are a bivalve, meaning they have 2 shells. Their shells can be distinguished by their elongate shape and distinct fluting or sharp ruffle to the edges. Granted, sometimes this fluting is less pronounced depending on the habitat conditions. The color of the Pacific oyster varies, but they're typically white with purplish and brown coloration. Living oysters will be found with their shells tightly sealed and anchored to rocks, although sometimes they can be found dislodged from their original substrate. It is likely that you'll even find oysters growing on other oysters. Now that you know what a Pacific oyster looks like, it's time to measure them. For this, all you'll need is a set of calipers, a datasheet, writing utensil, and a monitoring team. While this monitoring can be done solo, we find that it's easiest to have a team of at least 2 folks. One person takes the role as data recorder, and the other can be the oyster measurer. If you need access to monitoring supplies, you can always borrow an oyster monitoring kit from Harbor WildWatch. The oyster measurer will use a pair of calipers to measure from the umbo to the greatest diameter of shell growth and call out the measurement for the data recorder. The millimeter length for 100 living oysters should be recorded on the datasheet. When measuring oysters, it is important to do your best to measure indiscriminately. While it's easy to find and measure just the biggest oysters, we want you to be on a careful lookout for the little oysters too. In some cases, you will find 100 oysters in a single area. Other times, you'll have to move across the beach to find those 100 oysters. It's even possible that there are no Pacific oysters found on that beach, which is okay because zeros are important too. It's also important to only measure living oysters. Look for oysters that have 2 tightly sealed shells. The living oyster doesn't have to be attached to a rock, but if the shell is cracked open or there's only half a shell, do not take measurements. You should also be careful to avoid measuring oyster lookalikes. Especially when it comes to smaller oysters, they can often be confused with some other intertidal friends, such as the rock jingle and slipper snails. If you stay above the line of green seaweed during a low tide, you'll be less likely to encounter these oyster imposters, as these species tend to reside closer to the waterline than the Pacific oyster. If you encounter a specimen that you're uncertain about, take a picture along with your measurement and we can help you identify it. Once you've recorded 100 oyster measurements, you can email a picture of your datasheet along with the name of the beach, the date surveyed, and the name of the folks on your monitoring team. These measurements of living oysters give us a size frequency dataset to determine how oyster populations change, showing both the growth of individuals over time and the recruitment of new oysters into the population. Persistence of Pacific oysters is a potential threat to the persistence and recovery of the native Olympia oyster. This is especially true under the warming conditions of climate change. With the help of community scientists around the Puget Sound, we can increase the scope of this project and better understand the ecological changes taking place in Pacific oyster populations. Learn, have fun.